And the first thing, inevitably, we have to think statistics. These figures are from 2015, so may well, almost definitely, well on the lower side of the current situation. And we hear a lot about refugees. But looking at the figures, it's an even bigger picture than most people in this country will understand. We've got a total, 2 or 3 years ago, of 65 million people forcibly displaced from their homes. And of those, we've got round about 25 million who are refugees or asylum seekers. And that leaves at least 40 million who are internally displaced. The refugees are entitled to protection under the Refugee Convention because they're technically refugees. And what distinguishes them from internally displaced people is what's in the name of the internally displaced people. Refugees have gone across their national border. The majority, the 40 million, do not cross their national border. They're displaced maybe even just a few miles, maybe hundreds of miles from their homes, but the point is that they are forced out of their homes. And nobody talks about them. And in fact, not a lot of people know they're there at all. And so that's why it will be good if we can focus on them for the rest of this morning, because we don't hear about them, and yet there are twice as many, pretty well, as there are refugees, of whom we hear a lot. And we especially hear about refugees when they come, quote, dangerously close, unquote, to our own country. We talk, as John said, we talk about internally displaced people. That is not an accessible, attractive sort of term. It describes what they are. You could call them internal refugees. In a sense, it's just a matter of degree. Technical refugees have crossed the border, but anybody who is seeking refuge is, at one level, a refugee. Exactly the same sort of issues as refugees, the same sort of reasons, the same sort of needs. If you've left home, if you've left everything, then you've got the same sort of uncertainty, the same fear and vulnerability, whether you've travelled a few miles from home or whether you've crossed a border and you're in a completely different country. And for refugees, for internally displaced people, you've got the same range of reasons for being forced away from your home. And the most obviously, the highest profile tends to be conflict, and we think of Syria, elsewhere in the Middle East. We've got Colombia, as Sarah was talking about, Nigeria, South Sudan, so many countries around the world where conflict forces people out of their homes. Then there's the whole area of discrimination, persecution, perhaps on grounds of political views, religious views, sexuality. Climate change increasingly is a cause of displacement, of forced displacement, when homes are destroyed by floods or hurricanes, or nomadic agriculturists are having to move because drought is destroying the grazing for their cattle, or they just can't grow their crops anymore. And then there's land grabbing by big companies, and as Sarah said, hydroelectric schemes can flood huge areas, destroy communities. All sorts of reasons, all forcing people out of their homes. And yet they're invisible, and they're overlooked, and they're ignored if they don't actually cross a border. And all of that, they're ignored by the international community, and they're ignored by international law. There's virtually no protection for internally displaced people, except for a set of voluntary guidelines that the UN produced 20 years ago. In fact, this year is the 20th anniversary of those guidelines. And they're voluntary, and that means that not a lot of people either know about them or do anything about them. And that's actually not acceptable, and it's not fair that just because people have not crossed a border, they're without protection. Their needs for shelter and food and water and dignity and hope are just as great as those of the people who've crossed a border. But hardly anyone knows they're there. And if we can quote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy again, they are, if we do know about them, they are somebody else's problem. And they're in the too difficult category. So all of that is why Christian Aid actually started thinking, is there something we could be doing or should be doing so that internally displaced people, the forgotten 40 million, cease being somebody else's problem? And the starting point was our experience of supporting refugees and internally displaced people in many countries around the world. And we've been working with refugees for many, many years. And in the last 2 or 3 years, we've supported new partners in Greece and Serbia, supporting refugees as they came in to Europe. And with internally displaced people, we found, as we examined our programs, that not only were we supporting internally displaced people specifically with specific programs, but in many, many other countries, we were finding that internally displaced people were part of host communities where we were providing support, our partners were providing support in all sorts of ways, but kind of almost incidentally and almost unwittingly, there were many internally displaced people hosted in those communities. So we had that kind of contact and access and experience. And it's actually worth pointing out that unlike refugees, the majority of internally displaced people are not in camps, in official supported camps, but they are hosted informally by local communities who do it sort of basically out of the kindness of their hearts and out of a sense of solidarity. And virtually never will those communities get any support to help them in hosting strangers. And that's remarkable, and it's shocking that it needs to be done. It is shocking that they're not getting any support, because they are not exactly the wealthy parts of the world. So you've got really, really poor people helping people who are even more really, really poor, you know, really at the bottom end of vulnerability. And personally, this is not scripted, but personally, I think it's a total disgrace that we see that level of generosity and commitment among the poorest communities in the world. And then you get a country like ours saying, keep out, not interested, not our problem. So we've looked at our various programs and experience over many years in many, many different countries. And we've been using that as the basis for a shift to looking and working on the even bigger picture, the idea of migration, of forced displacement specifically, of every kind, globally, not just focusing on refugees anymore, but they're still sort of part of the thinking. Not even thinking specifically about internally displaced people, although those are a huge part of our thinking and motivation, but thinking more generally, why are people forcibly displaced? And what can we and our partners and our allies, and we hope a movement, a global movement, what can we achieve together to support some of the most vulnerable people in the world? And we're doing this because we see the need, and because we are a Christian organisation, and because this is a moral issue, and it's a question of justice, and because we as Christians have a responsibility to challenge the ignorance and the ignoring and the neglect. And we have a responsibility to promote the inherent value of every human being, wherever they are, whatever their displacement status. And the churches have credibility and authority and a biblical mandate, biblical requirement to speak out and to challenge the sort of injustices we're seeing in this country, in Europe, globally. And it's this prophetic calling that we talked about earlier. And it is our problem. And as Bishop Jonathan said, it's our problem in particular, because we are the churches, we are the Christian community. And as our thinking has developed, and this is where we will value your thoughts, this is what we've come up with in terms of the messages that we want to communicate and the challenges that we want to inflict on the world. And the first one is, as I say, that there should be a global focus on everyone who is forced out of their homes, whatever the reason and however far they travel, and move away from the relatively narrow focus on refugees, but including refugees in the bigger focus. And then the second one is that civilians who are displaced but remain within their countries should receive adequate protection. And then the third one, I mentioned the UN's guiding principles, and that those should actually be integrated into national laws and policies and then implemented. Something needs to be done with them. And we have colleagues who are working in Geneva with the UN's Special Rapporteur, working into relevant processes on all of this. And then some of you will be aware of the World Humanitarian Summit a couple of years ago. One of the big things that came out of that was localization, which means that decisions and action and support to people who have humanitarian needs, so not just internally displaced, should be implemented at the lowest possible level, so communities and local organizations rather than big international organizations coming in and doing stuff, getting the decision making, the implementation done by people who are actually really close to the action and know the issues. And that's where churches locally in relevant countries have a huge role and are performing amazing roles. So that's what we're aiming for. And the next question inevitably is the how question. And the first big opportunity comes in September of this year, where the UN will be coming together to agree what it's calling compacts, which are international agreements on refugees and on migration. And what would be absolutely brilliant, and it won't happen, is if there was a really good chunk on internally displaced people in one of those agreements. And we know for a fact there will not be. We know that already there is a sort of tiny mention somewhere in one of them. And what we're aiming for is to get rather more of a mention of the needs and vulnerabilities of internally displaced people, to get that somewhere in these agreements. But even if that doesn't happen, it will at least give us, and we hope many, many other people across the world, an opportunity to say, actually, these agreements are totally inadequate. This is what is needed. If there were a great, wonderful move forward on internally displaced people, we could, again, strategize from that point. But we see the UN Compact's September this year as a good staging point. So we're working towards that. We're working to raise awareness in as many different ways as we can in this country of the existence and needs and vulnerabilities of internally displaced people. One of the ways we're doing that, that Barbara mentioned, is developing an exhibition which will be available to go around churches around the country, which will be interactive and tell stories of internally displaced people, raise awareness, give a lot of information, and then offer opportunities for people actually to do something. And so that's exciting. Christian Aid Week in May, the theme will be internally displaced people, and we have a story from Haiti as the centre of that. So there's a lot of momentum in terms of awareness raising. We're also starting to think about campaigning, getting members of the public, our church supporters and the wider public, to contact their MPs and start asking questions of MPs, saying, actually, this is important to us. What are you doing? What is the government doing? We want you to do more. And aiming to get the UK government to be really actively involved in this global UN process. And the momentum is building even now. And we're very fortunate that we're working with Anglican Alliance, and there's a really good partnership developing there, really important to us. And we're looking for more and more churches and denominations and church leaders around the world to build this movement so the momentum can be built and the challenges can be communicated.